Did you ever ask yourself how Japan became one of the most powerful and economically developed countries in the world? How did the economy of Japan grow so vastly even after the devastating impacts the country had to face in the world wars held in the last century? In this case study, we will explore all these factors. Early in the 1990s, Japan lost its reputation as an economic powerhouse, the one to imitate in terms of industrial policy, managerial strategies, and product engineering, and was plunged into its greatest economic crisis since World War II. The Japanese people were able to establish a new economy from scratch following Japan's loss in World War II, since everything they had accumulated over the years had been destroyed. The U.S. occupation of Japan resulted in several reform initiatives that helped rebuild and recover the shattered country, ultimately giving Japan the chance to become an economic superpower. The dissolution of the Zaibatsu, land reform, and labor democratization were the three main reform initiatives carried out by the American troops. These reform initiatives significantly impacted the nation's capacity for growth as well as its capacity for democratization and modernization. By putting the Dodge Plan into action and using the impact the start of the Korean War had on it, the Japanese economy was able to recover. The start of the economic miracle was highlighted by the so-called Korean War boom, which saw a sharp rise in output in the economy. The key to Japan's incredible development has been its people's capacity to emulate and put into practice the information and skills acquired from Western nations. Other drivers of expansion were the import of technologies and better business circumstances. Additionally, the economy was highly impacted and accelerated by the economic policies and methods employed by political figures. In the history of contemporary economics, Japan's transformation from a defeated World War II state to a major economic force in less than 40 years has been a fairly noteworthy exception. Before the loss in 1945, Japan's whole strength was devoted to winning the war and creating havoc in the process. Many of the industrial and commercial structures, along with the equipment they house, had been destroyed, and a lot of the equipment that had previously been utilized to produce goods for the civilian market had been destroyed to make metal for explosives. The Japanese people who survived the war were faced with turmoil, famine, and unemployment upon their return to their nation as a result of this concentration of power utilized in warfare. With over a fourth of its housing stock destroyed, the Allied occupation forces arrived to help the stricken country. Despite being left with wastes and ruins of companies and infrastructures, Japan was able to rebuild its economy from the ground up by drawing on its pre-war economic experience and learning from the rest of the world. To comprehend Japan's post-war economic growth, we must look at its economic development and history from the 1800s to the early 1900s. Because of Japan's historical isolation from the rest of the world, agricultural technology created during the Tokugawa period was able to narrow the gap between the Western powers and Japan. During the Meiji period, the central government implemented a series of modernization initiatives that made it easier for Japan to acquire technology and ideas from Western nations. Beginning in the middle of the 1880s, Japan was able to advance the economy on the path to modern economic growth thanks to the legacy of the Tokugawa period and the early Meiji period's development of the economic growth foundations. Since Japan was densely populated and had few natural resources, it was forced to rely on commerce to meet its basic requirements by 1900. As a result, Japan was prepared to extend its empire on a wider scale. Japan was one of the most powerful nations until the end of World War II, both militarily and economically, and the foundations for its future development were already in place. Now, the Japanese economic miracle is explained by 6 major factors. The Korean Threat. The US and its allies fought the Chinese and North Koreans until they were defeated between 1950 and 1953. Large quantities of food and military supplies were purchased by America from Japan nearby. This amounted to a large wealth transfer from American tax-paying citizens to the Japanese economy. This procurement boom, along with other American aid after 1945, contributes to part of Japan's early economic development, but these transfers mostly vanished after the Korean War. Economic freedom. The Foundation for Economic Education fee honors Toshio Murata, a Japanese economist of the Austrian school who translated Human Action by Ludwig von Mises into Japanese. World Bank's 1993 study of the Japanese economic miracle acknowledged that liberalization was an indispensable factor in Japan's rapid growth, but that is belied by the fact that MIT's interventions were neither huge nor effective. In explaining the Japanese economic miracle, some people suggest that government industrial policy agencies such as the Ministry of International Trade and Industry (MITI) were its main architects. Japan became freer economically during the decades of economic liberalization than it had ever been before. Industries that had been run or heavily regulated by the old imperial government or by American occupiers were set free. When the country turned toward a bigger government in the 1990s, the growth momentum stopped. Japan still ranks an impressive 35th in economic freedom among the world's nearly 200 nations. Punishment to growth. U.S. policy in the early months of the occupation of Japan tended to be punitive, designed to keep the country down and out. In 1947, as the Cold War with the Soviet Union and Red China worsened, the Truman administration decided that a stronger, freer Japan would help stave off communist advances. Brutal describes the punitive tax regime imposed on Japan by Americans in the immediate aftermath of the war. Sky-high taxes kicked in at relatively low income levels, and exemptions were few. By 1949, America was actively encouraging the integration of a depressed Japanese economy into world commerce. Tax cuts. The golden age of American intellectuals on the left in Japan was brief. After the end of the American occupation in 1952, Japan's tax reduction quickened. Tax reductions on investments and savings were particularly stimulative. Public policies shifted from leveling and equating incomes to focusing on increasing productivity. Similarly, Japan gradually lowered its taxes on the purchase of foreign goods. For example, by 1975, Reynolds notes, the effective tariff on autos fell from 40% to 10% and the tariff on televisions from 30% to 5%. Dodge and Deming. Although consulting whiz kids and planner types in the ivory tower was trendy for many governments throughout the world in the 1940s and 1950s, Japan, to its credit, paid them little mind when it had options. In reality, Japan escaped the stagnation that was typically caused by left-wing academicians by listening to two famous figures from the business world. Joseph Dodge and W. Edwards Deming were their names. In 1949, Joe Dodge was sent to Japan by President Harry Truman while serving as chairman of the Detroit Bank. He was to assist General Douglas MacArthur, the Supreme Commander, in financial matters and lead the country out of its economic misery. The solution was what came to be known as the Dodge Line. It put an end to hyperinflation by adopting a balanced national budget and stopping the printing press. The yen-dollar exchange rate stabilized as a result. All forms of government economic involvement were significantly decreased. Dodge's goal was to ultimately let the Japanese economy alone, not to plan it. He eliminated every price cap and subsidy he could find, and MacArthur applauded him the entire time. For their significant accomplishments, these two individuals have a huge debt to the Japanese people. The recovery would likely have stagnated or reversed if the nation had adopted the conventional thinking of the time, which was held by academics with a left-leaning bias. General MacArthur's Constitution. The sixth ingredient in Japan's economic miracle was far from insignificant. It is not possible to envisage a successful economic rebound or Japanese-American relations without the vision and charisma of Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur got along so well with Japanese officials, especially Emperor Hirohito, that most Japanese regretted his departure in 1951 when the American occupation came to an end. He oversaw the creation of a new constitution with measures to safeguard limited, representative government, free and fair elections, private property, and individual liberty. It went into effect in May 1947. For 7.5 decades, that constitution has governed Japan without the modification of a comma, as one critic put it. The younger generation of Japanese people who are less amenable to subordination may be the only ones who can bring about real change. They desire access to better homes, a more fulfilling and healthy family life, and chances for personal development. People may be encouraged to build a healthier sense of self if this new generation can create a culture that is more consumer-oriented. As a result, the nation may be able to cultivate the inventive culture necessary to thrive in a rapidly evolving global economy.